Thanks, Lindsay. Hi, everyone. My name is Michael. I'm an R3 in the Health Equity Pathway. As Lindsay mentioned, all of our presentations today are by pathway residents. And so before we get started, I want to quickly plug the pathway. It's awesome, highly recommend. I know applications are due in a week plus-ish, so if you are at all interested, have any questions, please reach out to one of us or the amazing Dr. Ryan Abe, who is the pathway director. All right, so I'll be getting started today with a talk on critical race theory. I initially thought of doing this talk in like 2021, where there was a lot of CRT being mentioned in the media, a lot of it in a negative sense. And I was sort of alarmed and worried because it's really, as a field, really important to me and many others, since it's sort of where a lot of anti-oppression theory, teaching, and frameworks come from, especially in academia. But I also wasn't very surprised that it's like very easy to vilify. So I thought, like, how could I have a discussion or at least introduce this topic to people? So as an outline, we'll talk about kind of the current context with which a lot of people are encountering it, the history, some of its core theories, and then its applications to healthcare. A lot of this is like dense social theory, so please interrupt my lecturing with questions, comments, etc. if things come up. So kind of along the lines I was describing, the objectives for this talk, my hope is that by the end of this, everyone will be able to at least kind of have a description of critical race theory if they were to have a conversation about it, kind of underline some of the key tenets from critical race theory, and then recognize how those things, my cat, manifest in the practice of medicine, in your everyday life, and beyond. And I'm always a big proponent of reflection, so kind of ongoing reflection on how to apply sort of the transformative ideals of critical race theory to your everyday practice. I don't have any disclosures. All that priming being said, I'm just wondering if a couple of people could throw out if they have any experience or just like what they're understanding from maybe what's been bandied about in the media, like of what critical race theory actually is or could be. Chat is fine if. Okay, well, I can kind of say how I have been encountering it, more recently. So it's something that I studied a little bit in college, but more recently, I feel like it's been kind of really taken off in conservative media and then in like a lot of state policies as something that's been banned or it's like kind of vilified. There is actually an interesting article that describes how it was really just one person, actually he's not from Seattle, but he did this while in Seattle. He kind of very intentionally manufactured a lot of furor over critical race theory. His name is Christopher Rufo. I don't even know what to call him. He's not like a journalist. Like online, he's like a conservative activist, which I didn't really know was a thing, but it makes sense. He basically was hearing a lot about how people were, and it was 2020 pandemic. A lot of people were having to sit through like anti-bias trainings and workshops at work in corporate settings and also government settings. A lot of this was in the wake of the George Floyd murders in the summer of 2020. But people were kind of frustrated by these things, sending him screenshots of like bonkers things they were encountering in these trainings. And then he kind of tied that all to critical race theory. And in September of 2020, he went on the Tucker Carlson show and kind of publicly called on Trump to basically ban it. His language was, it's absolutely astonishing how critical race theory has pervaded every aspect of the federal government. And he called for Trump to stamp out this destructive, divisive, pseudoscientific ideology. 2 days later, there's an executive order, this one coming out of the Trump presidency, that it's come to the president's attention that millions of taxpayer dollars have been going to fund this divisive anti-American propaganda. And then the language that's further on in the memorandum, is asking agencies to identify any training on, quote, critical race theory, quote, white privilege. It doesn't really define these concepts, right? But, it's implied in the following sentence that these are propaganda efforts that suggest that one, the US is inherently racist or that any race is inherently racist, which hopefully by the end of the talk, the whole point of critical race theory is that that's not the case. And it's like, how does racism persist when it's not, when there's no one that's inherently like racist? So, given this like very strong language in this, executive order from the president, it's not surprising that very quickly there was a lot of reporting on how the evils of CRT, how it's so dangerous, anti-American, it's actually racist in itself, all these things. So a lot of conservative news outlets in 2021 really kind of picked up on critical race theory. And actually Rufo was pretty intentional. There's a quote where he says he like felt like every part of the phrase critical race theory would like cause some sort of response from Americans. Like, all those words just like are easy for people to harp on and think of as like something bad. And kind of worked in his favor. And when Biden took presidency, he ended the ban, but sort of the train was out of the station. You can see kind of a bill from Texas here, but a lot of states passed legislation banning either critical race theory or a lot of the concepts like found therein. So here is a map of legislation. This is from March 2022, but of, kind of what various states of legislation across the US look like as in regards to proposed or like passed legislation. So actually the language in a lot of these bills is really vague. Very few of them explicitly mention or define critical race theory. A lot of them are banning really just discussion of race, racism, bias, oppression, privilege, in kind of a variety of school settings from like K through 12 to higher education. So the kind of core concept is the banning of the thought that the US is inherently racist, but a lot of these discussions about concepts of like conscious, unconscious bias, privilege, oppression are like now, really restricted in a lot of these states. Unfortunately, also, a lot of these bills also included like gender, sexuality, reproductive health, other topics that I think it's important for people to start learning about at a younger age. But, sort of all of this happened in the wave of this like kind of as a backlash, right, to a lot of this training that came out of, I think, the Black Lives Matter movement and George Floyd's murder. And if you're wondering why Washington State is purple, fret not, at the end of 2021, our governor signed a couple of Senate bills, 1514 and 52227. These ones are actually targeting not like undergrad or not primary education, but our public colleges and universities. So it kind of calls for Washington's 40 public colleges and universities to conduct training sessions and assessments for faculty and staff member on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and anti-racism starting this year. So that probably kind of explains some of the UW trainings that we have to go through. But again, the bills in Washington don't mention critical race theory in itself. They're just kind of focusing on these topics that they think are important for us kind of as a society to kind of think more about race and racism. And, despite not really naming critical race theory in these bills, there was also a bit of a backlash in the Washington media in the 2020s in regards to this bill. And there is currently a Republican Senator, Jim McCune, who's planning to introduce what he calls a Parents' Education Bill of Rights. One of the packages in the bill is the Individual Class Freedom Act, but it's trying to prevent K through 12 instructors from teaching critical race theory. The executive director of our state education agency kind of responded to this in an email and basically was like, critical race theory isn't taught in any of our K through 12 schools. So I'm not sure what you're trying to, ban here. And, I think that would be accurate because as we're going to talk about shortly, critical race theory really isn't, critical race theory in itself is sort of a graduate level discipline and not something that we that in its core is something that would be taught in elementary or middle schools, etc. But the concepts it talks about definitely I think are important. So kind of that leads us to a description of critical race theory. It's a bit of a chunky quote, but I think it encapsulates sort of the history. And really, critical race theory refers to a body of legal scholarship that came out of Harvard Law School in the 70s and 80s. Really, the forefront person was this woman named Derek Bell. and then a lot of his students that went to Harvard Law at the time. And what kind of unites their thinking is that they realize that despite, this was in the 70s, despite the Civil Rights Act of 1965 and this public understanding that now the US had colorblind neutral laws, that there was still the perpetuation of racial discrimination, hierarchies, oppression. And so it's important to actually really look at race when thinking about legal arguments. So it's technically a jurisprudential theory, which is fancy word for like legal theory. And so it's something that's evolving, that's changing, but really made to answer a question of like why and how does racism persist in our country despite our laws seemingly, being neutral and trying to create equality. So kind of the story of critical race theory then starts with Derek Bell. He is the first Black law professor at Harvard Law School. And he became known in the 70s and 80s because he published a lot of papers that were kind of counter to the traditional civil rights discourse of the time. I think there was a lot of, after the civil rights movement of the 60s, there was a lot of celebration, understanding that like things were better now, America cared about its Black people, that the laws had changed, the Civil Rights Act has passed, and all kind of, everything that Martin Luther King was fighting for, that Malcolm X, that they had kind of resulted in this better society. And Derek Bell kind of critiqued a lot of that and was like, wait, but there are still issues that I'm noticing, and how come we're not talking about that? In particular, he really looked at the after effects of Brown versus Board of Education. And as a reminder, that was a Supreme Court ruling in 1954 that ruled that it was unconstitutional for school segregation. And so that kind of led to, ideally, the desegregation of schools and more generally of America. But throughout the 60s, a lot of neighborhoods in the South were still de facto segregated. So like, despite the law saying like we should desegregate, like that wasn't really happening, for a variety of reasons. But there was still this trend of there being a lot of Black communities and neighborhoods and cities. And so Black kids would go to schools there, whereas a lot of the white families moved out to the suburbs further away, and that's where they went to school. And so a lot of cities found in the 60s and 70s that there was still a lot of segregation in schools, even though that was meant to have stopped. So in 1971, there was another Supreme Court decision that basically ruled that rather than just passively desegregating, cities needed to take responsibility to proactively integrate their cities. And this led to a practice called busing, where children would get on buses and get driven kind of really far away to attend different schools kind of far away from they were, trying to account for, again, the discrepancy in demographics. But what Bell noticed is that this kind of actually just created a whole host of new problems for Black students. It didn't really fix anything. So, he was like, desegregation didn't really fix the problems that segregation caused in the first place, but really just made life harder for some Black students who, he was really like, looking into this one girl who had to ride the bus for hours to get to school and then face a lot of hostility from like white classmates and parents when she finally did get to school. So he made the argument that, like our American education systems shouldn't focus so much on like desegregation as like actually improving the quality of education for its Black students. So that's sort of similar thoughts what we think about in healthcare, right? It's like, what are the outcomes and how do we improve the outcomes, regardless of what the intentions are, like what we're doing up at the top. So Derek Bell published this book, Racism in American Law, which is sort of the first law book looking more specifically at race and law. And it became a course that he taught at Harvard Law. In the 80s, he also introduced a concept called interest convergence. And again, this was pretty controversial at the time because he was arguing that the civil rights movement and the US dismantling Jim Crow laws, they didn't do that because they being the people in power, which he called white elites, they didn't actually care about the rights of Black people, but because at that time, being seen as a civil rights, friendly country or treating its citizens better was good for the reputation of America. In particular, this was in response to the ongoing Cold War, which was going on from the 30s through the 80s, right? And lots of actual warfare going on, but also this great ideological battle between like West and East, right? So capitalism, democracy, the West, and communism, socialism, the East. And obviously there's a lot of propaganda on both sides, but the Soviet Union was trying really hard to appeal to people all around the countries, particularly in like African countries, Asian countries, South Asian countries, South America, and also to Black citizens in America to be like, hey, like, the US purports itself to be the ideal, this beacon of democracy and freedom on the global stage, and yet it's like mistreating its Black citizens. You're trying to march for your freedom and they're hosing you down, they're setting dogs on you. Like, that doesn't seem right to us. Like, come check out how life could be like in Soviet Union. Obviously, they were also committing a lot of human rights violations, but this was their tactic to kind of at least tarnish America's reputation. And Bell felt that that was effective, right? And it did seem contradictory for America to be spouting its message and, kind of trying to crush the civil rights movement, so that it was within the interests of the ruling class of Americans to kind of give more rights to Black people, but not because they actually wanted it per se. There is actually like a phrase in the Soviet Union at the time. It's a Russian phrase, but it translates roughly to, and yet in your country, you are hanging Black people. So they were referring to lynching, and it was often like a response when people would try to bring up the human rights violations in Russia or the Soviet Union, or kind of talk positively about America. It was their like counter to be like, well, look what you're doing in your country. I think that is all just to give context to where Bell came up with this theory of interest conversion, and was really thinking, like, why is this happening? And he didn't necessarily think it was like because like people actually were trying to get rid of racism. So Bell continued to do a lot of cool things. I won't get into too much detail. Throughout his law career, he really wanted to champion getting more Black faculty into law schools, or people like just women faculty of color. He briefly left Harvard Law, not briefly, he left for a while to actually be the dean at University of Oregon School of Law. And he was dean for 5 years. He actually left because he really wanted to hire this Asian woman professor to the law school, and then the school offered it to 2 white men, and then when they both said no, did not offer that spot to the Asian woman. So he was like, bye, and he left. So solidarity. But he kind of remained a skeptic throughout most of his life. So you'll see some of these books that he later wrote, like And We Are Not Saved. Clearly was never quite convinced that things would be getting better. In fact, in 2008, a journalist interviewed him on basically the Obama campaign, and was like, oh my gosh, like Obama is getting elected, first Black president, like how do you feel? And Bell's response was, we can recognize this campaign as a significant moment, like the civil rights protests, the 1963 March for Jobs, the Brown decision, so many more great moments that in retrospect promise much, but in the end signify nothing except that the hostility and alienation toward Black people continues, in forms that frustrate thoughtful Blacks and place the country ever closer to its premature demise. So at the time, Jelani Cobb, the journalist, was like, wow, that's like really grim. It's like 2008, Obama ran on this campaign of hope, like literally like, this is, shouldn't you be kind of excited? And your response is that like things are just going to get worse and the country's getting closer to demise. But now Jelani Cobb writing this article in 2022 after the Trump presidency, after January 6th, is like, he was pretty prescient, right? Like he was very clear on kind of the racial dynamics in this country, right? And kind of pointing them out really well ahead of even now what we're kind of like rediscussing in 2020. Yeah. But enough of like Bell's fatalism. How did critical race theory extend beyond his teachings? And that really was with a group of his students, foremost Kimberly Crenshaw, who's actually the kind of lawyer that termed the theory. But basically when Bell left Harvard to go to other schools, no one was teaching his class on like race and racism in the law. And a group of these students, so Kimberly Crenshaw is here down in the bottom, and then there's like Mary Matsuda, Richard Delgado, Patricia Williams, all, so a group of predominantly law students of color, but also there are definitely a couple, there are white allies as well. We're like, we should get together and kind of lead this course for ourselves because it's really important and we need to talk about this more, even though Derek Bell is gone in our school. So they were really interested and influenced by other movements that came out of the time. So throughout the 60s and 70s, lots of social change happening in America, lots of like new ideologies. And in the legal world, there was this thing called critical legal studies, which came out in the 70s, mostly from white progressive lawyers. But they were kind of trying to make a very contentious point, which was that the law is in fact not neutral, despite being based on objective principles, that the law actually often codified the marginalization of certain social groups. They were specifically referring to like women and immigrants, but that the law maintained social hierarchies instead of being natural. And what was missing though was kind of a discussion of race. They didn't really mention race as one of the ways these social hierarchies were maintained, and these scholars were really interested in that. So to distinguish it from critical legal studies, Kimberly was like, we should talk about critical race studies. And the critical, the word critical in this setting isn't so much like criticizing, but sort of the same way we talk about critical thinking, which is like the intellectual capacity for us to really analyze something, like consider it, break it down, and then kind of judge and make changes based on what we're thinking about, right? So critical thinking, and that's sort of where this term was born out of. And the other kind of big body of work that really influenced these scholars was radical feminism. So that is a branch of feminism, part of the second wave of feminism in the 60s, very important, but the radical coming from like the root of the cause. So radical feminism really recognized that or their theory, which I would say is pretty true, is that society is patriarchal, that men oppress women in relationships in society, and that, the quote, abolish the patriarchy kind of comes from radical feminism, which is to change things, we have to remove the systems that allow men to be financially, economically, socially benefiting from society, in a way that actually is detrimental to women. Radical feminism was also kind of different from earlier first and second wave feminism in that it stopped viewing women as sort of like a monolithic group and just like men and women, and started to realize that oppression came in different ways. So like race, class, and like sexual orientation, these were other ways that, oppression affected women and all people. And that kind of leads to the concept of intersectionality, which we'll talk about a little later. But those were kind of the core movements that influenced critical race theory. And it's since expanded and kind of captured more of the influences and thoughts of other Black writers from the past, and it's like Sojourner Truth, Frederick Douglass, W.B. Du Bois. It was also influenced by other like movements in the 60s and 70s. So aside from radical feminism, also like the Black Power movement, post-colonialism, Marxism, all of these thoughts at the time creating this body of work. So now that we kind of talk about where it came from, like what are some of its core teachings? And, the good news is that a lot of these teachings aren't things that really need to be like heavily argued or proven like they were doing at the time. I think it's actually a lot of these things are things we now learn in medical school or kind of accept to be true. But the first one of them is that race is socially constructed. It's a product of social thought and relations. I don't have to go into that one too much. But the next one, which was kind of groundbreaking at the time, was the idea that racism is ordinary and subtle. And that racism, it's an everyday experience for people of color or marginalized people living in societies, that it might be invisible to other people who don't experience racism or discrimination, or don't quite kind of, have to deal with it every day. So to them, racism is not ordinary, but all of this makes it ordinary in the sense that it exists in the background of everyday life. It's going on in the background, and some people are aware of it and other people aren't. And Kimberly Crenshaw would write that she believes, racism is essential ideological underpinning of American society, but because it's so embedded in our legal system and our history, not because of explicit and intentional prejudices on the individual level. And returning to Derek Bell's thought about interest conversion, at the time he was calling it white over color ascendancy, but I think white supremacy is another word for it. His belief was that white supremacy did serve positive purposes for white people, both psychically and materially. So even if they weren't aware of it. So his quote, "The ongoing subordination of Black people and people of color provides white people with a comforting sense of their position in society, whether or not they want it." So he was thinking, even if you're not aware of how you're actively benefiting from it, at least the ruling class of white people, the wealthy white people, were benefiting socially and capitalistically from racism. And then a lot of other people were just simply unaware of it and benefiting from it. So no one had the incentive to actively dismantle it, was a thought that he had. And so that's kind of buoyed by the interest convergence, is that if it's not in your interest to do something about it, you might not act or even be aware. And then also at the time, this idea of white supremacy being supported by colorblind neutrality laws. And in the legal sense, colorblind refers to this idea that perhaps we could reduce prejudice by just ignoring race. If in the eyes of the law, an individual's race or ethnicity shouldn't influence how they're treated in society, so we should just ignore it. But I think we can often see that that's not the case in terms of incarceration, in terms of who gets consequences to committing crimes, like trying to overthrow the government, and who gets extrajudicially murdered by law enforcement, etc. And I know I don't have to convince any of you all, but Crenshaw and Matsuda really had to argue about why colorblind neutrality was not a thing. So their argument was that if colorblind laws worked, if they were neutral, if in fact our laws were equal, why do we still see disparities between people of color, Black people, white people? Why do we see disparities in wealth, property, education, and health outcomes? So they were like, unless you accept that Black people, A, just naturally deserve those things, or B, have a desire to be second-class citizens, why does this keep happening, right? And so if you reject the racist belief in natural inferiority, or if that there's some choice in wanting to have these disparities exist, then there must be something accounting for that difference, whether it's racism embedded in our laws or kind of this everyday racism, or this invisible white supremacy culture that's supported by kind of all of the above. So that, that was the argument they were making. And some of the final three tenets, the first one, the next one, the dominant society racializes different minority groups at different times in response to shifting needs, such as the labor market. So this is an idea that kind of comes out of Marxism. Marx was also really, interested in social hierarchies, but he was really looking at class, capitalism, and communism. So a key Marxist belief was that the ruling social class would determine kind of the structure of society. And there's this concept of cultural hegemony, in which the ruling class is able to control and manipulate the culture of society. And then everyone's beliefs, perceptions, values become, the worldview of the ruling class becomes a norm of the entire society. So most of this was coming out of Europe, right? Literally they were talking about the aristocracy and the ruling class, the monarchy, right? So the British monarch's values are the values of the people, and everyone buys into that and it's accepted. And even if it's not working in the best interest of the people, right? So I think that's really easily, it's easiest to apply that to capitalism, to CEOs and the working class, right? And why are we doing all the work and other people making money? But there, Marx had this idea of class consciousness, which is sort of the awareness and the beliefs that people held about their own social rank, how they interacted with other ranks, and what was just basically going on in society. And he felt that an awareness about consciousness and what was going on was kind of key to sparking revolution and a change for people to act in their best interests and not of people with more power over them. And so this kind of, Derek Bell and a lot of these critical race scholars took these thoughts and kind of applied them to race in America. I should also mention that, all of this talk about critical race theory really is specific to American racism, anti-Black racism in America is where all this critical race theory is born out of. Since then it's, we can use it to study Asian American and Latinx American people, and these theories have been expanded, but the core of it was kind of anti-Black racism in America. So, they took these ideas of consciousness and also applied it to race. So the ideas of race consciousness, critical consciousness, just kind of understanding what was really at work here and acknowledging how that affected people on an individual level. And the last two tenets of critical race theory, one of them is intersectionality. So it's a term, to kind of briefly define it, right, that tries to make more sense of the like power and privilege. It's the idea that every individual has multiple identities. They can overlap, they can intersect, but every single one of these identities opens them up to different degrees of empowerment or oppression, right? So you have different levels of privilege or marginalization depending on different identities you have, and all of that's really complex and informs your individual experience, and it's hard to kind of monolithically assume someone's experience just based on one facet of their identity. You know, and then some of these identities are self-held, you know, we think of these as ourselves, and other ones are kind of just ascribed externally by people in society, and we don't often have control over that, or, you know, or over the social structures that kind of define which identities are oppressed or privileged. And his last thesis was voice of color. So he was making the argument that there's so many different histories and experiences, but people in the majority group were unlikely to know about the experiences of people that were not like themselves. So they had to kind of be told it via storytelling. You know, I think today we would say that's like representation, right? It's so important for the lived experiences and stories of any person, but particularly people whose stories have not been told or have been silenced actively, kind of to reach everyone so they can better understand and learn about the experiences of others. I would also say in our times, it's, you know, I don't know that it's necessarily the responsibility of the people in the minority group to go and try to educate people in dominant group, but rather if you're trying to make change, find restorative justice or equality, then you should actively try to seek out the experiences and histories of people that have been oppressed and kind of take action on your own. But storytelling, and especially centering the perspectives of those in the margins, is kind of really important concept of critical race theory. It's like, how do we give power to those people whose power has been taken away from them, or even just give them a voice, right? Which is, you know, yeah, a big part of medicine, I would say, as well. So to briefly recap, you know, I think a lot of this sounds familiar, but core theories of critical race theory is that racism is ordinary every day, but not knowing about racism or not actively doing anything about it actually works to support the structure of white supremacy that we have. And ways to counter that are representation, storytelling, and the kind of thoughtful reflection that then turns into action. And there's this tweet here that's just making the point that, you know, literally making laws to ban critical race theory is confirming the point that the laws in our country keep propagating racism and these structures that are, you know, that are not even invisible. Like we see them, we can talk about them, but, you know, they kind of go on even if there's not a conscious thought on our part about perpetuating them. Yeah. So to kind of wrap things up, I wanted to talk about how critical race theory has made its way into like the public health and medical spheres. And this happened in 2010. Collins Arihenbua and Chandra Ford, sort of in a series of papers, were trying to introduce critical race theory to the healthcare world. Really, how do we turn all this theory into action? How do we apply it to the research we're doing, the knowledge we're producing in the medical field, so it actually results in outcomes, right? That we can change disparities that we're seeing in our healthcare system. The title, so they did a study, which I'll briefly talk about in the next slide, and then they published a paper about how they tried to incorporate critical race theory tenets into their study design. And that paper is this one with the title above, Toward Anti-Racism Praxis. And the word praxis is like a social theory word. It's gets thrown around a lot, and really it's kind of a confusing concept because as a lot of social theory concepts go, or like education concepts go, it's like very theoretical. But the whole point of praxis is that we talk a lot about theory, academic theory, social theory, but how do we turn that theory and realize it into like practice or an active ongoing process? So that's what the word praxis aims to encapsulate. It's that ongoing iterative process where we get knowledge from a variety of sources, and then we kind of inform practice and goes in a circle. And Ford and Arihenbua were also really big on the idea of centering the margins. So really, how do we focus our studies and research, knowing that there are these power dynamics within medicine, healthcare, on people that are socially marginalized, and not just kind of benefiting the comfort or the outcomes of people that already belong or in the dominant group. So the study they conducted was actually on HIV testing amongst Black people in a city in North Carolina. So the study was informed by the fact that even today, but definitely in the early 2000s, Black Americans had higher rates, later diagnoses of HIV, but worse outcomes, more progression to AIDS and death. And so they're trying to answer, like, why is this happening? And specifically, though, they wanted to look at racism as a risk factor, not race. So one of their points was, and kind of consider the intersectionality within Black people when they're writing their reflections. So the study design kind of sought to look at racism in two ways. One was perceived individual racism. The other was kind of demographic residential information. So for the perceived part, every participant filled out a questionnaire where they were asked about their perceptions of everyday racism, experienced everyday racism at work, in public. For example, like if you go to a store, do you feel like someone might think that you're trying to steal? And then they answered that on a Likert scale. So that was trying to capture individual experiences, their perceptions of racism. And then the other metrics they looked at were like looking at participants based on like city blocks and then looking at kind of demographic information about those blocks. So I won't really go into the details of the study results, but you know, in the design, I think Ford was trying to be really intentional, again, about using racism as a risk factor. And instead of comparing like Black people to other groups like white people, Asian people, again, kind of these like, definitions we use in healthcare, but are arbitrary, really looking within a diverse population of Black people within the city of North Carolina and seeing, are there differences in why they're accessing healthcare and how does racism influence that? And get a better nuanced understanding in that sense. You know, I think so kind of public health at large is now kind of trying to look at barriers like this and kind of seek to improve outcomes that way. They were also really key into seeing that like racism and people's perception of race do inform medical decisions in healthcare. You know, I think that's something that we're like, yes, that makes sense. But in 2010, even then, that was sort of an introduction to the fact that we need to look at people's perceptions into race or their experiences with racism and how that influences their engagement with their healthcare system. And finally, they tried really hard to center the margins. So they did a lot of outreach amongst the communities before they started doing their research study, like what was the best way to distribute the questionnaires, how could they reach a good population of people. And they also recruited and trained Black community members as their research assistants instead of using people like students or other people at the university. So despite that being more time intensive and labor and research intensive, those are efforts that they made to kind of change the power imbalance between academic institutions and the communities that they were conducting research in. And then this is sort of like a dense slide of, again, more social theory, but relevant to people who are interested in the kind of medical education. There's a lot of charts like these in the kind of the education sphere, but they were kind of just remarking on how, and I wanted to emphasize the point, how like knowledge production, you know, we think of it as objective, we think of science as objective per se, but they're all inherently subjective. You know, the norms and conventions of a discipline, whether it's science or history, you know, whatever discipline, law, there are already existing norms and conventions, and that kind of already shapes our knowledge, how we think, how we put knowledge together, our theories, which then it goes on to kind of reinforce the knowledge that we create. And we should acknowledge this and kind of actively try to not do that when we're producing knowledge. And also that knowledge should then result in action. So researchers should use the knowledge they obtained through their studies to help disrupt one or more causes of the inequities they saw. That should be always one of the goals of your research. And, you know, otherwise, like, what is the point of this knowledge production if it's not leading to like action or change? And then to bring us more recently towards this final goal of like transformation. So like, what do we, you know, we can try to conduct good research, but like, what are other ways we can actively kind of mend or take accountability or create better outcomes for people that face disparities? So one thought is this idea of reparations, right? And that's an idea that exists in largely in regards to kind of racism and a lot of other forms of oppression. to Black people, to Indigenous people all across the US, but should there be some responsibility for institutions or the government to actively repay the people that they've oppressed in the past, whether financially, socially, or through some programs. So I think that's always one of the dreams that a lot of scholars and activisms hope for coming down the pipeline. I don't know. We'll see how it becomes realized, if it becomes realized in our society. But a couple of doctors at Harvard were trying to actively integrate this into some of their practices at Brigham and Women's Hospital. And this came out of a study out of Harvard, actually their cardiology service. So a lot of residents and faculty members felt like out of the patients they were seeing, Black and Latinx patients with heart failure seemed more likely than white patients to end up on the general medicine service instead of the cardiology service. And on the cardiology service, they had better outcomes, also a more comfortable experience, like private rooms, better amenities. And so I think someone posed the question, like, is this actually happening? Because it seems like it is. So they studied it and they collected 10 years of data. And it was true. So there is this discrepancy. More white patients end up on their card service, more patients of color on the general medicine service, where there's not a cardiology attending. And looking through this data, it wasn't accounted for by insurance status. It wasn't accounted for by established links to care, other medical conditions, or even an index that reflects the socioeconomic status of the patients. It really was their race. And then so a follow-up study was conducted. So why was this going on? And it was also a study kind of on attitudes, but that study found that from a provider perspective, white patients were perceived to advocate more on their own behalf or be more knowledgeable about the system. So they advocated for cardiology admission more often and more intensely, but providers did acknowledge that this behavior impacted their decision-making, that they took that, that advocacy did sway them to some amount. And maybe that's what resulted in this disparity that we see in this study. Obviously, that's not, like the public institutions, county hospitals such as Harvard U receive like an enormous amount of Medicaid and Medicare funding, specifically for people who are already marginalized or have low socioeconomic status. So for them, for that money to result in more disparities is like that's not how it should be. That's obviously wrong. So two of these doctors, Bram Wispel-Lee and Michelle Morse, both doctors and professors at Harvard, were like, how do we go about fixing this? Like, what is a structural way we can do to try to at least make things equal, if not actually have some form of reparation? And what they did is they kind of studied the theory of reparations in a lot of ways and came up with this. They didn't come up with it. Someone else had already come up with this acronym for reparations called ARC, which is acknowledgement. So to acknowledge, first of all, that there's an issue that needs repairing, to make it be clear that we as an institution, we as a government know that this is wrong, that we've done this and we want to do something about it. And then offer redress. So how do we restitute for these past injustices? And then eventually closure, because you can't say it's something that's done until the community is like, yes, we accept that this is, closure. And they are trying to institute this ARC process in actually their EMR. So, I mean, if you're more interested in what exactly they do, I would Google this title and the paper will come up. But they changed the electronic medical record so that actually there's like a pop when there's Black and Latinx patients presenting to heart failure, there's a pop-up that's like consider admitting them to the cardiology service, not the general medicine service, to have this like active reminder to providers, so that they're not just relying on discretion or patient advocacy to determine things like that. I think the concept of reparations is still something that is a lot of people have a lot of feelings about, obviously, and but it's cool to see, and I feel like consensus is probably hard to achieve, but I'm glad to see that there are institutions that are actively thinking about like what are ways we can preferentially actually focus care on patients who need it the most. Yeah, so to that end, I'm returning to this chunky description of critical race theory, but I'm highlighting the point that it's a framework, again, a legal scholarship framework from the 70s and 80s, but now it's been expanded and applied more generally to social discourse and practice. I think it has those tenets have applications in your daily life, but also definitely in your practice of medicine. And hopefully we can prove Derek Bell's skepticism wrong, right? Hopefully we need to show him that we want to change racism and fight for equity, not only because it's financially or socially beneficial to us, but because we truly want equality, transformation, and betterment of society. Yeah, so thanks for coming to my TED Talk. Here's a bunch of resources that I've used. It's actually listed from like most pop culture reading friendly to like literally legal text down at the bottom. But I can just drop some random articles in the chat too during break if you all want to click through them. And thank you. Thanks for listening. It's something I care a lot about, and it's been cool to share it with everyone. Oh, questions, comments, concerns, but also if not, we'll head into the break. I'll hang out.
Michael, I'm seeing a lot of thank yous and that you're amazing in the chat. And some asking for some articles in the chat too. I went ahead and linked to the article, the What We Owe Patients, Case of Medical Reparations with Michelle Morris. But I'm not sure if there are other specific articles folks want, or maybe just copying and pasting some of them in. Yeah. See some clapping emojis.
Sorry, Kayleen, I didn't see your answer to my question in the chat. I didn't realize the chat was going on, but thank you.
Yes, I'm sorry, I didn't do a great job of moderating the chat. But yes, Caitlin provided a definition for critical race theory, and then John and Nikki also pointed out that it really has not been that long since Seattle was sort of actively busing students, and John linked to an article in The Stranger from 2016 about kind of when sort of speaking to this the kind of when that practice ended. Yeah, okay. Well, maybe we'll take about a 10-minute break. Does that sound all right to folks and speakers? And Michael, if you want to put some of the links in the chat, either now or later, that'd be great. And we'll reconvene at 10 a.m. For our next talk with Connor.